Take a coin out of your pocket. Feel the weight of it. Now, imagine taking a pair of industrial pliers, clipping off the edges, and throwing those scraps into a melting pot to make a second, thinner coin. You haven't created wealth. You've committed a crime. But when a citizen does it, it's called counterfeiting. When the government does it, it's called monetary policy. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire didn't fall to a sudden invasion or a plague. It fell because the men in charge decided to play a shell game with the world's most trusted currency. They turned the Roman Denarius, the silver heartbeat of the ancient world, into a silver-painted lie. They didn't just destroy their economy, they destroyed the concept of trust itself. Welcome to the Historical Audit, where we find the missing pieces behind history's greatest events. To understand the scale of this disaster, you have to realize that the Roman Empire was essentially a giant, armored extraction machine. It didn't have a tech sector. It didn't have a service economy. It had legions. These legions were the engine of Roman growth. They would march into a territory, seize the gold, enslave the population, and send the loot back to the center. For centuries, this worked perfectly. The new business of conquest provided a constant injection of physical silver into the system. The denarius was the symbol of this success. Under Augustus, it was nearly 4 grams of 95% pure silver. If you were a merchant in the Silk Road or a sailor in the Mediterranean, that coin was better than a contract. It was a physical promise. You knew exactly what it was worth. It was the world's first global reserve currency. But here's the problem with an empire built on conquest. Eventually, you run out of neighbors worth robbing. By the middle of the 1st century AD, the frontiers had reached their limit. The forests of Germany were too thick, the deserts of Parthia were too vast, and the mountains of Scotland were too cold. The injections of new silver stopped. But the operating expenses did not. Rome was locked into a high-maintenance lifestyle. It had to pay for a standing army of 400,000 men, a massive welfare state in the capital, and an infrastructure network that spanned 3 continents. In the year 64 AD, Emperor Nero found himself staring at a balance sheet that didn't add up. The Great Fire of Rome had gutted the city, and he wanted to rebuild it as a monument to his own ego. He needed money. He didn't have enough silver to pay for the bricks and the soldiers simultaneously. So, Nero did something that would haunt humanity for the next 2 millennia. He called in his mint masters and gave them a secret instruction: dilute the silver. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from 95% to 90%. On the surface, the coin looked exactly the same. It felt the same. But Nero had just discovered the cheat code of governance. He realized he could pay for 10% more empire without actually finding 10% more silver. He was taxing his people without telling them. This was the birth of indirect confiscation. This is the first audit point. Inflation is not a natural disaster. It is a policy. It is the silent theft of the labor of the past to pay for the mistakes of the present. Nero thought he was being clever. He thought he was managing the crisis. But he had actually set a match to the foundation of the state. For the next 2 centuries, the Roman Empire became addicted to this silver wash. Every time an emperor faced a revolt, a war, or a budget shortfall, he turned to the mint. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the silver content was down to 75%. By the time of Septimius Severus, it was 50%. The Roman denarius was becoming a mulberry coin, purple on the outside, but rotten on the inside. Severus was the man who truly weaponized inflation. His dying words to his sons were, "Stay on good terms with each other, be generous to the soldiers, and pay no heed to anyone else." It was the ultimate crony capitalist manifesto. To keep the soldiers loyal, he gave them a massive pay raise. To pay for that raise, he debased the currency again. This created a death spiral that would destroy the 3rd century. When you pay a soldier in debased silver, the soldier realizes that his raise doesn't actually buy more bread. In fact, because the merchants aren't stupid, they raise their prices to match the lower quality of the coin. So, the soldier demands another raise. To pay for that raise, the emperor debases the coin even further. It was an economic Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. By the year 268, the denarius was effectively 0.5% silver. It was a copper slug dipped in a silver wash that wore off after 3 days in someone's pocket. The global currency was now a joke, and the result was a systemic heart attack. Trade collapsed. Why would a merchant in Egypt ship grain to Rome if the money he received in return was literally worthless? International trade requires a standard of value. Without it, the world's first globalized economy fractured. Ships stopped sailing, roads became dangerous. The middle class was wiped out. And then came the crisis of the 3rd century. In a 50-year period, Rome had over 26 different emperors. Most of them were soldier emperors who seized power, gave the army a raise they couldn't afford, debased the currency one last time, and were then murdered by their own troops when the inflation caught up to them. It was a leveraged buyout of the throne, over and over again. Enter Emperor Diocletian. He was the man who tried to anesthetize the collapse by force. Diocletian understood that the economy was broken, but his solution was the ultimate authoritarian trap. He believed that if he couldn't fix the value of the money, he would fix the value of the things people bought with it. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict of Maximum Prices. This was the most massive attempt at price control in human history. He set the official price for over 1,000 goods and services. A bushel of wheat, 1 price. A pair of boots, 1 price. A haircut, 1 price. If you charged more than the official price, the punishment was death. Not a fine, not a prison sentence, execution. He was essentially trying to outlaw supply and demand. The result was a total catastrophe. Merchants didn't lower their prices, they simply closed their shops. Goods disappeared into the black market. People who had spent their lives as specialized craftsmen, bakers, carpenters, tanners, could no longer afford to work. They fled the cities. This is the missing piece of history that most people forget. Inflation created feudalism. Because the money was worthless and the price controls were deadly, Roman citizens did something radical. They abandoned the global system entirely. They moved to the countryside and attached themselves to the estates of wealthy landowners, the villas. They traded their freedom for food. They became coloni, the ancestors of the medieval serf. They stopped being citizens of a global empire and became laborers for a local lord. Rome didn't fall because the barbarians were stronger. Rome fell because the Romans stopped believing in the Roman system. They had been audited by reality, and they chose to opt out. Now, we come to the modern mirror. We come to 2026. If you think the Roman story is a dusty relic of the past, you aren't paying attention. We are currently living through the greatest monetary experiment in human history. Since 1971, when the world moved off the gold standard, every currency on Earth has become a fiat currency money that has value only because the government says so. It is the silver wash on a global scale. In the last 5 years alone, the world's central banks have printed more money than in the previous 100 years combined. We call it quantitative easing. We call it liquidity injection. But if Nero were alive today, he would recognize it instantly. It's just debasement with a better marketing department. We are seeing the same mechanical logic play out in real time. The military-industrial trap. Just as Rome debased the coin to pay for the legions, modern nations are printing money to service a debt that has become a national security threat. The sunk cost of welfare. We are anesthetizing the public with subsidies and stimulus checks to hide the fact that their purchasing power is evaporating. Gresham's Law 2. Just as the Romans hid their real silver, the modern smart money is fleeing into hard assets, Bitcoin, real estate, gold. They are opting out of the paper system before the silver wash wears off. We even have our own versions of Diocletian's maximum prices. We call them rent controls, price caps on energy, and interest rate manipulation. We are trying to use the 4-3, power of the state, to ignore the reality of the market. And just like in 301 AD, these measures are creating shortages, stifling innovation, and hollowing out the middle class. The Historical Audit of Rome reveals a brutal truth. You cannot print your way out of a productivity problem. You cannot solve a systemic deficit with digital debasement. Every empire thinks they are the exception. Every emperor thinks they can manage the inflation better than the last guy. But the ledger of history is cold. It doesn't care about your ideology. It doesn't care about your crisis management team. It only cares about the balance sheet. Rome mastered everything. They mastered engineering, law, and warfare. But they failed the most basic test of all. They failed to respect the value of their own money. They chose the temporary fix over the long-term stability. When the Goths finally walked through the gates of Rome in 410 AD, they didn't find a superpower. They found a shell. They found a population that had already given up. They found an empire that had literally spent itself into extinction. Take a look at your bank account today. Look at the value you think you have. Then remember the Roman merchant holding a silver coin that was actually 99% copper. He thought he was rich until he tried to buy a loaf of bread. History is a cycle of audits. And right now, the global economy is facing a final audit that has been 50 years in the making. The missing piece of the Roman collapse wasn't a barbarian spear. It was a pair of pliers in a Roman mint. If you want to survive the next cycle, stop looking at the news and start looking at the money. Because when the illusion of value shatters, the only thing that remains is the truth. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe, share with your friends, and join the Audit